remote work is increasingly common across many fields. One aspect of remote work that I think doesn't get discussed is the difference in culture that is at the foundation of what I might call remote first work, distinguishing that from what we might call telework, an environment that is principally on site in an office, but may have some or a lot of work done outside of the office. You may find a telecommute job where you spend most or even all of your time working from, let's say, your home office, and yet the work is still office-centric. The communication process is made around in-person communication. Contrast this with a remote work environment where the assumption is people are working not in a shared office space. You may have an office, a headquarters, it may be well populated, but the assumption is that any given worker at any given time is predicted to not be in the office space, and as such the communications focus on this asynchronous kind of communication. These are two very different approaches, office first or remote first, but it may not be evident from looking at an organization which method it is applying. If you just look at an office and you see that there are people there, and you ask how much time is a typical worker spending in the office, you may get comparable answers from an office first environment or a remote first environment. But the culture around each of these work environments could not be more different. An office-centric workplace is expecting its employees to participate in in-person communication, for them to use the office as a headquarters or as a base of operations. The organization is more likely to sink money into activities to bring employees in the company together. And likewise, many of the people who work for this organization are likely to be the sort of person who is looking for a more social work environment and benefits from the small interactions throughout a day with their coworkers, or knowing that they always have this home base that they can come back to if they want to feel more in the loop. Whereas in a remote first work environment, the assumption will typically be one of a disparate workforce spread out, largely independent, and the company will typically focus on facilitating the individual worker to accomplish their assigned tasks rather than a focus on establishing an environment for socialization and collaboration. And that's not to say that such an organization doesn't understand the value of collaboration, but the focus is on the worker as an individual rather than the workforce as a group. And correspondingly, the employees that will tend to work for or enjoy working for this organization will typically be more independent-minded, prefer, at least to some extent, being siloed in their work, and the organization will facilitate them in that regard. And that's not at all universal across an organization or the employees working for it, but it is likely to be the principal approach in such an instance. But when you're interviewing with a company, considering working there, it's not necessarily going to be immediately obvious from more straightforward questions what kind of company you're dealing with. You can ask about communications strategies, how people work together, how many people are in the office on a typical day, what the office culture is like. And that will tell you maybe if you're going to be comfortable there generally, but it will not tell you whether you fit in with that workforce, whether you fit in with that company culture. It can be a subtle distinction, but it can be an important one, because someone who expects a certain level of interaction throughout their day and can't seem to drag it out of their coworkers anything but reluctantly, their own work will suffer. And correspondingly, someone who is looking to just be left alone and get their work done and finds themselves constantly pinged by their coworkers for small things that they consider unimportant, or feels like their schedule is locked into place by other coworkers, their work may suffer. This is an important concept as remote work becomes more common. Everyone is aware that having good communication technologies is important. Everyone is aware that having good protocols in place to support remote work is important. Most people are also aware that it takes a certain kind of individual to succeed at remote work. But it's equally important to be aware of the culture that is within an organization for how it views remote work. Is a remote worker someone who happens to do some of their work outside of the office? Or is a remote worker someone who occasionally stops by the office? And we can't measure this by time spent working remotely versus time spent in the office. It's much more than that. It's about how you communicate. It's about how you work. It's about what you look for in your day. And the majority of people on a team or on a company need to be on the same page or very close to that in order to have a successful work environment.